I know it can be hard, even terrifying, to minister in the margins, to minister in those fringe spaces where only the forlorn traverse, where only the broken walk, where only the outcast tread. I know it can be terrifying. I know it can be overwhelming. I know at times we can worry about a lot of other factors when we are out ministering in the margins. But here's what I want to say very clearly today. Not only did Jesus minister in the margins, but he's calling us to the same space. Today I'm in Matthew chapter 8, and I'm wrestling with 2 out of the 12 consecutive miracle accounts. Because it starts off in Matthew chapter 8 through 9, 12 miracle accounts, but it starts off with a very specific one that I think sets the tone for every other miracle that follows. Matthew chapter 8, verse 1 begins like this. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. He just finished preaching the Sermon on the Mount. They are enamored with his teaching. They are enamored with his preaching, and they begin following him. They follow him from the stage into the margins. So a large crowds followed him. Verse 2, and a man with leprosy came and knelt before him. That is scandalous on so many levels. Those with leprosy would stand off at a distance, crying out, unclean, so that no one would come in them. No one would come near them. And so that no one would become unclean, sacrilegious, impure, and therefore unable to fulfill all of the duties of worship, the important aspects of worship, especially inside of the temple. So not only are they in the margins, and not only here do we have crowds that are following Jesus, but we see Jesus go close enough to the margin where the leper can no longer hold it in. He comes racing to see Jesus. And in essence, whenever he comes into Jesus' presence, he would make every person in that crowd, Jesus included, religiously unclean. But his desperation, his longing for healing is so intense that he's willing to be further marginalized in order to come to the feet of Jesus. He came and he knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean so that I can have my family back, so that I myself can have community back, so that I can, in the eyes of God, be once again a part of his people, no longer in the margins. Lord, you are the one that can make me clean and can heal what is broken in me. Verse 3. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Like definitely, don't get me wrong. I am willing, the next line, be clean. And then it even saying immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Those are amazing. Those are exciting. But the most startling words in verse 3 do not have anything to do with the healing. They don't really have the emphasis of even the be clean. The most startling words is that Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. Why? Because whenever you are going to be making clean the leper, whenever you are ministering in the margins, whenever you come across those that the world considers unclean, we have to remember that we are not infected by what makes them unclean. As a matter of fact, the cleanliness or the purity of us is what is infecting them. This is such an interesting, This is such an interesting tension in the church, and I understand it. Because throwing random people into unclean, or better word, into unsafe environments like bars or like even like ministering in strip clubs can be very dangerous, because not everybody's heart and purity is at a place where they can handle going into those spaces. And yet, church, we were called to the margins. We were called to the places where the unclean of our society go away, hide away, forgotten by the world, looking for someone to come and to make them clean. They're crying it out with every drink that they drink. They're crying it out with every pornographic experience. They're crying it out, Lord, make me clean. And sometimes we forget. We are so worried about our own cleanliness that we forget that our ministry happens in the margins. But if we are close enough to Jesus, then what ends up happening is that we don't become infected by their infection. We actually infect them with our purity. We infect them with our holiness. We infect them with Jesus. The next miracle scene is Jesus with the centurion, and he heals the servant from a distance. But I want to skip that one and go to verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with the fever. Now notice this in verse 15. He touched her hand. He reached out and he touched her. And the fever left her. The fever didn't infect Jesus, just like the leprosy didn't infect Jesus. The fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. And when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him. Once again, people on the margins. And he drove out the spirits with the word, and he healed all of the sick. And then verse 17 reminds us not only of Jesus' Jesus's mission in the margins, but it also compels us with our ministry and mission in the margins. It says this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and he bore our diseases. He took what was broken in us. He took what was infecting us into himself. And what he ultimately does is infects us with the healing. He infects us with the antidote. He infects us with God. Sometimes we avoid the margins in our society. Sometimes we avoid the margins in our own heart because we fear that if we get too close, it will infect us. And for some of you, it is not safe to go into a bar if you are struggling alcoholic. But trust me, the margins have many different faces. From lepers to demon-possessed to those that are in sick and imprisoned by fevers, and those that are just simply caught up in their sin. But as you press into Jesus, don't forget that the brokenness of this world doesn't have to infect us. We infect it with Christ. So my challenge for you this week is this: don't shy away from the margins. In your family, in your community, and in your own heart. Reach out and touch those that are broken, infecting them with the healing power of Jesus. I love you guys. Have a good week.